Climate change is an urgent and existential threat, and all countries have to build on the Paris Agreement to address this global challenge to humanity.
Welcome to Cities of Tomorrow, powered by ENGIE, where we explore what it takes for cities to achieve net zero carbon emissions amid Asia's rapid urbanization. This is your host, Matt Rickard. Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of the Cities of Tomorrow podcast. Today I'm chatting with Amandeep Bedi, the Director of ENGIE's Impact Sustainability Solutions team in APAC. And we're here to talk about net zero cities. So Aman, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Mark. Happy to be here and just share and exchange ideas. I work with ENGIE Impact Sustainability Solutions team, which is basically a consulting advisory firm working with clients in helping decarbonize faster, better, and hopefully cheaper. Thanks.
Awesome, man. Well, we're going to talk everything, net zero cities, educate the audience on that, and, maybe dive in with really, I suppose, the big question here. What role do cities play in sustainability and net zero transition?
I think cities play a very important role overall in any form of a climate change or net zero kind of discussion, simply because, as countries have urbanized faster, newer cities are coming into shape. They are the hubs of economic activity. And if you look at it, the top cities probably will take up a few percentage points in terms of overall surface area, but they're home to a large chunk of population. And as a result, what people estimate is approximately 60% of global carbon dioxide emissions are coming in purely from cities themselves. So they have a very active role in decarbonizing and supporting any country's net zero plans and ambitions.
Cool. I mean, how should we, envision tomorrow's kind of net zero cities? What strategies are in place or need to be put in place to meet that vision? What's being done now? What's coming down the track? I imagine there's a lot of work to do and, cities are a big part of this. So, what are the type of strategies that need to be put in place?
So there's definitely a lot of work to be done. Even if we look at it now, approximately 700 cities across 53 countries have made some sort of a net zero pledge where the ambition is to try and be net zero by 2050, 2060 in some cases. And I guess a big part of the whole transition is to figure out, what are the sources of emissions and what is the impact they have on the cities. Studies have indicated that primarily in a city, buildings and transportation have a huge role to play in terms of the overall emissions. And when you look at net zero, these are definitively areas that cities need to work on. Transportation is a multi-tiered problem because you need to figure out and have enough road infrastructure and other, let's say, infrastructure like train networks to connect cities within each other, and also have the right level of services being made available in buses, or trains. To sustain the transportation network and make sure that people end up using that more than the conventional automotive, which is, let's say, more fossil fuel intensive. And linked to that is the point around, okay, can cities electrify their fleets? A lot of cities are moving towards that direction, including Singapore, which has made very strong, ambitious plans around basically putting up a lot of charging infrastructure, which I believe is the best thing to do, because you will see a lot of automotive companies coming out with automotive, electric vehicles, but where things end up being stuck is the lack of charging infrastructure. So you and I, if as a consumer want to buy electric vehicles, our first question is, can I really charge it up wherever I want to? Is it going to be fast enough? And are there going to be enough points available in the city for me to not have range anxiety in any form? So I think Singapore started doing the right thing in making sure that the infrastructure is present, while the market basically takes care of providing enough choices for consumers and end users to do this. That said, the great thing also is that Singapore is making sure public transport is used as much as possible, along with providing supply of electric buses, which help in carrying larger number of people over a longer distance in a much more carbon efficient way. In some cities around, if you add it up, around 20% or 25% of emissions come from purely buildings alone. And if you add the element of construction and the embedded carbon, that number goes way past 35% overall. And that's where people have seen that a big chunk of the carbon emissions sit. Now, the way to look at it is to start at building level, understand how can you make buildings more efficient. Even the basics around making sure you're operating the air conditioning at a certain temperature range, which is optimal, having enough LED fittings, having more energy efficient devices, definitely is a great starting point. But I guess more needs to be done on the building side to either centralize infrastructure, especially on the cooling side, which is a heavy emitter, to basically bring down the overall emissions for buildings. Those are things that we are seeing happen quite actively in the market, and cities are working towards it. But as we say, it's more needs to be done and needs to be done faster. And that's where regulations and incentives come into play to help drive and push that discussion forward.
I mean, it's not a simple problem, right? It's there's a lot of moving parts. Government, business, people. Interesting when you chatting at the beginning there. Obviously, the car manufacturers coming in with electric vehicles before there are enough charging points. I mean, these are real problems. I mean, city planners. What's their role? What's the role of business? I mean, how do these roles differ? You answered it a little bit then, but just to dive in deeper, the role of city planners, the role of business, in terms of achieving this.
The role of business is sort of fairly straightforward. It's to provide a solution, generates a certain profit in line for what customer pain point they're solving. I think city planners have a much more tougher job than we can imagine. So if you're a city planner, imagine you've got to keep the city economically viable. You've also got to have the city which serves the needs of various stakeholders, the citizens, the business interests, and overall create the community impact. While now, if you add the other dimension of being, net zero. So these things don't sort of go together. They work in some ways in conflict. So city planners have a role in making sure that there is this element of economic viability, which means it attracts business, it creates opportunities for people to earn a livelihood and for businesses to sustain themselves, while also making sure the communities that the city serves are basically getting a quality of life that is more sustainable, I would say. And that's where a lot of the design thinking comes in terms of how do you design cities, how do you make people move in a city, how do you make sure that your laws and regulations nudge and push people, businesses to make the right energy efficient choices. Are there enough supporting enablers around regulations, around enforcement that make sure that people are designing better, more energy efficient buildings? People are for the older buildings, are there more retrofits available, which mean they can become much more efficient? Are consumers and communities encouraged to be more responsible in their consumption habits so that you don't over consume, which is a cause for emissions? And finally, I think making sure that overall the sum total of the design in terms of transportation networks, in terms of how people move, is in a way circular enough to minimize excessive waste in any form. So it's a very complex, multi-tiered problem, and in many cases, trying to satisfy one stakeholder leads to some other stakeholder being unhappy. So yeah, it's not an endless job, I would say.
So is there a case for starting at the small precinct level and scaling out from there, and maybe a good segue and opportunity to share some of the work that ENGIE been doing in Sentosa, NUS, Punggol, in the digital district?
Definitely. I think, starting work at a precinct level allows precinct planners or city planners a lot of flexibility. Number one, they can test bed quite a few solutions. Number two, they can actually institutionalize ways and means of actually doing things, which means what behaviors do they want to institutionalize so that it sort of promotes a more sustainable lifestyle. Number three, I think, again, linked to the first point on test bedding, it gives people a lot of flexibility to change things around if they're not working at a much smaller scale, where it's easier to do than in a much larger, complex city environment. We've done some work with NUS and Sentosa, where the preliminary focus was to first understand what the baseline problem was. So if you look at carbon emissions as a topic, it's not so easy to measure, especially when it comes to complex real estate environments, primarily for the reason that everyone owns their own electricity consumption, water use, energy usage in all form, and collecting all this information can become a Herculean task. So you got to find an optimal trade-off in terms of the level of detailing you go to, but having a reasonably good enough answer. I think in our experience, when we started work with these precincts, we realized that these are complex. Data is not going to be available. Not everyone is going to be happy sharing information. But I think we figured out an optimal way using standards, proxies, and some estimates. And in many cases, data which was not available, we had to basically estimate by speaking to the people who are closest to the data on site. So is building the picture of where you are in terms of energy emissions. And then also, understanding what drives that, which means knowing what will actually increase or decrease it, what activity is going to influence this emission as you look forward. So if for a precinct like NUS, if you expect more students to be coming in, it means more services, and all the associated emissions because of that would increase. Similarly for Sentosa, the more visitors come in, the more food they will consume, the more they will travel around the island, which means more emissions. So it's understanding the key drivers that help us understand what levers do you want to use in basically reducing the emissions. In a simple case, with Sentosa, we figured out that there was a large area of land available across locations where you could consider solar. It could be land or it could also be water. So it could be floating solar. So there were things that we had to consider that allowed Sentosa the flexibility to make those sustainable choices without sort of taking away from the consumer experience.
So you may have touched on some of it there, but which aspects of urban sustainability are achievable today? And, what do we need to be saying, right, that's 5, 10, 20 years away even, because it's a complex issue. There's a lot of different influencing factors. What's the closest elements to realization, I suppose, versus what needs to just wait to be problems that we solve tomorrow?
So there's actually a lot of it that has been solved that could be implemented now with significant impact. So if you look at, simple energy efficiency as a solution, how do you make buildings more energy efficient? How do you make chillers and lighting systems and overall cooling systems, HVAC systems more efficient? I think a lot of the technology is already available. If you look at all the refrigeration, the refrigerants that go into refrigerating equipment, chillers, fridges, etc., a lot of zero global warming potential refrigerants are already available in the market. Now it's a matter of how and when can you actually switch them, in your chillers, etc., to take advantage of that situation. If you look at renewable energy has reached grid parity in many countries. Now Singapore is quite unique in that aspect because there's limited land for you to put up solar. Even then, through Solar Nova and other programs, there's been a lot of effort to maximize the solar potential for Singapore. But beyond that, if you look at the rest of the countries in the region, solar parity is already there, which means companies can actually invest in creating renewable energy supply. That said, of course, a lot of countries are still grappling with regulations in basically making the flow of renewable energy across grids and accounting for it much more efficient. That is a part that regulations will need to really catch up because there's a demand for it. There's definitely a supply available, but regulations sort of restrict that. So, and these are honestly the biggest levers you could look at for cities to start decarbonizing. If you look at electric vehicles, which is the other big element in the equation, supply is steadily coming in, although it's still a bit at the high end of the spectrum, which means if you are a business looking for value for money, transportation vans which are electric, it's still a tough thing to supply, to source them. If you're a consumer who's looking for a value for money car for a family or for longer commutes, getting that is still taking time. But I think the automotive sector has already made those moves, and we'll start seeing results fairly soon. And the charging infrastructure is something people are already thinking about. Singapore leads the effort in this market, and I'm seeing pockets in Indonesia, etc., where they're actually looking at building great business models around EV charging, especially for two-wheelers, because those are the predominant forms of transport there. So these are things that we're already seeing happen, and we should all be doing more of, because that's what will help us get some level of scale in reducing emissions.
We'll bring up the next problem to solve. I mean, can the public sector, the city planners solve this? Where's the role of innovation? and how can ecosystems work together? Is it a combination of all? What's the best approach here to look at these challenges?
I think, it's not a straightforward answer. I guess, number one, I think the city planners cannot do it on their own. It has to be a whole of society effort, which would include, you and me as citizens. There's, businesses, there's governments. But the whole thing is it needs to be a lot more coordinated. And a lot of the coordination and guidance needs to come in some way from the top, which says, okay, this is how we want to be. And countries are starting to set these nationally determined targets for their carbon emissions. It needs to start percolating down to what does each part of society need to do. And it's complex. It's sometimes very difficult to define things as what should businesses do, what should individuals do. Definitely, a lot of thought needs to go into design of services when it comes to city planners. They have to start thinking not only about cities as a place for people to stay and for businesses to stay, but more as how does it become more sustainable by design through the infrastructure that they put in, through the way they design the movement of people and goods in the city. Businesses, of course, have a responsibility. I think the core of business now is realizing that sustainability is a very important thing in the minds of both consumers as well as regulators and other stakeholders, and therefore, in fact, employees also. And therefore, they should be constantly looking to innovate to find more and more sustainable solutions, and services. And you're already seeing some sense of it in the market where there are more greener options available. There's clean electricity available. There's electric vehicle services that are available. There's green electricity for retail that's available. More and more consumer choices are organic or biodegradable packaging. So more and more is happening, and it needs to keep happening. And that's sort of finally ends up with you and me being as more responsible consumers. I think that's where the buck stops, because we have to start making more responsible choices. It might mean a change of lifestyle, which means probably, use the bike more often, walk more often rather than taking a car for everything. It might mean consumption patterns would have to change. Things like instead of eating a lot more meat, can I eat less meat? Okay, so it's those conscious choices that will send signals to both businesses as well as governments. And I think the more we talk with our money about where we spend and how we spend, the more it will influence the rest of the stakeholders to start making pushes towards a more sustainable city by design.
Good advice. I think, we're all in it together. It's a few steps together will make a long distance. So I didn't have any other questions, but is there anything I didn't ask that you'd still like to share? Anything, relevant to kind of net zero cities?
I think my sort of closing messages would basically be more needs to be done. And I think the time for action is now. A lot of people have already made, at least the plans are there. And a lot of it now needs to be action. We cannot be just waiting for someone else to tell us what to do. And I think every part of society needs to start getting moving in making those choices, in driving the sustainability path forward.
Cool. Look, thanks, Aman. Really appreciate you sharing today, with the audience. For people listening, there's a QR code that's popping up on screen now. So if you want to scan that, you can learn more about the work Aman does, his team does, and ENGIE more generally do in this area in terms of net zero cities. So thanks again, Aman. Really appreciate you jumping on the podcast today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity. And, I'd love to get any feedback. Thanks.